Hello, I'm Will Hewitt. This community of ours is a special place. Newcomers, longtime residents like myself, the native-born, all find something special in our town. Let's take the next few minutes to examine one of the things that for many of us make this a special place, and that is our past. Our past and how we treat it not only makes this a special place, but may predict our future. The community of Fort Collins is perhaps reflective of many Western towns. It is a blend of its past, present, and future. There have been a variety of attempts to preserve our past in and around the city. Some have succeeded, while others have failed. There have been several major losses which have permanently altered the cultural landscape. Some of those losses occurred during the town's earliest days. The war between the states in the 1860s led indirectly to the founding of the city of Fort Collins. As regular U.S. cavalry troops were ordered back east to fight in the war, some tribes of the Plains Indians saw an opportunity to drive the white man from their lands. Raids on the North Platte branch of the Oregon Trail forced the route of the Overland Stage and Mail Company's line to be shifted south into Colorado in 1862. Several small military posts were established along the trail, including one at Laporte, known as Camp Collin. On June 9, 1864, a flood wiped out this camp. A new fort, the Fort Collins Military Post, was built 5 miles downstream. It was named for a popular officer, Lieutenant Colonel William O. Collins, commanding officer at Fort Laramie at the time. The post consisted of 12.5 structures on the northeast side of what is now the Old Town Historic District. 2.5 years later, after the Civil War had ended and the need for protection had passed, the fort was abandoned and most of it dismantled. This was the earliest blow to historic preservation in Fort Collins. A few of the fort structures remained as homes and businesses for early settlers. Those people kept the name Fort Collins for their community and joined together to organize the Larimer County Land Improvement Company, which platted and organized the town in early 1873. Isabella Bird, writing in her book A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains, described her visit to Fort Collins in the fall of 1873. After riding from Greeley for 6.5 hours in an open wagon under the hot sun, she arrived in town. Fort Collins, she observed, consists of a few frame houses put down recently on the bare and burning plain. The dwelling where she stayed was freer from bugs than the one in Greeley, but full of flies. The lower floor of this inn swarms with locusts in addition to thousands of black flies. The latter cover the ground and rise buzzing from it as you walk. She could see little that was good. These new settlements are altogether revolting, entirely utilitarian, given up to talk of dollars as well as the making of them, with coarse speech, coarse food, coarse everything, nothing wherewith to satisfy the higher cravings, if they exist, nothing on which the eye can rest with pleasure. She certainly would not have felt any of that could be worth preserving. Fort Collins was then only a struggling village. Because of several hardships, including hordes of grasshoppers and the failure of the town's first bank during the early years, it looked as though Fort Collins might not survive. In fact, the town's population fell from 400 in 1873 to 300 in 1874. Most of the homes of this period showed a lack of confidence in any growth in the community. They were small and of either wood frame or log construction. There were only a few brick structures built during those first couple of years. By 1877, the picture brightened. The Colorado Central Railroad laid tracks through town, giving Fort Collins a major transportation link with both Denver and Cheyenne. This caused the economic picture to brighten, and people began to have confidence in the future of this fledgling town. The rapid growth that followed could be compared to that of today. Many substantial brick and stone structures were erected during the late 1870s and throughout the 1880s. So many quality buildings were put up during this time that one modern writer referred to the latter period as the elegant 80s. Homes like the 1879 Avery House, the Arthur House, and the Hottle House, both completed in 1882, helped define the period. The Opera House block of 1881 and the Miller block, mostly finished by 1888, remain as prime examples of the era. The next 10 years' growth came at a much slower pace, with new structures reflecting practicality as well as elegance. Franklin Avery's block, completed in 1897, shows this as well as any building of the period. The first decade of the 20th century was one of phenomenal growth due to an agricultural boom created by the sugar beet industry and lamb feeding. Great Western Sugar Company opened its processing plant in 1903 and began contracting with local farmers to grow sugar beets. Lamb feeding started in the 1890s, and together the two became economic mainstays for the next several decades. The dawn of the new century brought with it a dramatic change in architectural styles. Designs became modern, with less ornamentation and simpler facades, a strong contrast to the highly decorative Victorian motifs of the late 19th century. Some businesses took on a new look as their exteriors were modernized. The lovely commercial hotel became the unpretentious appearing Northern. After an extensive remodeling just after the turn of the century, Frank Stover's uniquely designed 1887 City Drugstore took on a much simpler look when a second story was added in 1905. Still, it was the homes, schools, business blocks, and public buildings of those first 50 years that laid the foundation for the character of late 20th century Fort Collins. In a modern preservation sense, there were trade-offs that resulted from that early growth. All but one of the buildings from the fort period had been demolished by that time. The lone survivor, the Auntie Stone Cabin, has been preserved and is part of the museum complex in Lincoln Park. The town's first two brick homes, those of Henry Clay Peterson and Sam Gano, and the first commercial brick structure, originally owned by William C. Stover, plus several other buildings between Jefferson and Pine Streets, were torn down in 1910 to make way for the tracks of the Union Pacific Railroad. Fires destroyed some of the town's original structures. Several other buildings in the downtown had their facades modernized prior to 1920. Between 1917 and 1919, the Opera House block underwent a major redesign. The whole front was re-bricked with light-colored brick. New windows were inserted, and elements of 20th century Beaux-Arts classicism were added. The Welch block also took on a more contemporary look. Thus, part of the College Avenue streetscape was changed for good. Still, a large number of early town buildings survived this era intact. Homes seem to be the enduring common denominator in maintaining the city's uniqueness, giving the town a sense of permanence, a certain feeling of unchangeability. A seemingly static preservation situation occurred from the 20s until after World War II. People used older structures in practical ways. Large older homes were converted to apartments or housed sororities and fraternities from the Aggies, as the agricultural college students were then called. Town growth was confined to filling in areas around the older homes and to building up the area near Fort Collins High School on the south. This phase, which lasted through the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war recession, served to preserve the small-town charm of Fort Collins, which had developed during the first several decades. A fairly minor growth in population also contributed to a comparatively small loss of the cultural landscape. It wasn't until the 1950s, as people began to paint interior woodwork, doors, and even fireplaces, that tearing down the old and building something new began to develop as a way of life that gave little thought to preserving the past. The era of the wrecking ball of progress had truly arrived. One whole block of historic homes disappeared at the opening of this decade. The 400 block of South College Avenue marked the beginning of the true residential neighborhoods at that time. Situated on the block on the west side of College were two stately old mansions, both built in 1899. One was the Welch Evans house, and the other the Gage Stover home. Both had ornate carriage houses behind them, and there were other houses on the back of the block. Safeway offered to buy the homes and build a 15,000 square foot modern supermarket, a term just then coming into vogue. The city rezoned the block from residential to commercial at the request of the property owners living there. Within a few months, the cultural landscape was altered dramatically when the homes were demolished. Fort Collins experienced the loss of both the county courthouse and the Franklin School within a matter of months in the mid-50s. Few people mourned their destruction as losses. Both were built in 1887 and had outlived their usefulness. At the time, they were viewed as old, crowded buildings that had become obsolete. A new courthouse replaced the old one. A grocery store with its parking lot took over the school site. What the loss of these two structures seemed to foretell was the expansion of the commercial district into the adjoining residential areas. People no longer saw the need to live close to downtown. The automobile became the preferred mode of transportation in those years after World War II, putting any part of town just minutes away. It also spelled the end of streetcar travel in Fort Collins and the rest of Colorado. The resultant destruction of old homes, churches, and businesses spanned the next quarter of a century. But perhaps the main cause of the high mortality rate among buildings during that time was Fort Collins' phenomenal growth. Between 1950 and 1960, the growth rate was 67%, up from 22% for the previous decade. The two following decades saw the population grow at a rate of 75% each. Old established businesses, particularly banks, outgrew their earlier quarters. Churches moved from their cramped downtown locations to larger edifices in newly developed residential areas. The demand for large chain stores spelled doom to the few old homes left in downtown. The first major casualty in the downtown came in 1961. It was the beautiful classical revival white marble and granite First National Bank building at Mountain and College Avenues. Franklin Avery's banking business had crossed Mountain Avenue into this magnificent structure in 1908. Longtime residents still talk about this lost landmark, but at the time, growth was viewed as good and necessary. Growth stimulated the economy, so more and more businesses required larger quarters with parking and modern drive-up facilities. Citizens believed sacrifices had to be made if Fort Collins was to change and grow. The voice of preservation was either silent or ignored. The 60s saw several historic homes on College Avenue replaced by modern stores and, the unkindest cut of all, parking lots. One of the premier old homes in the city stood next to the post office in the 200 block of South College Avenue. Built for mill owner Benjamin F. Huttle in 1882, its majestic Italianate style made it an awesome sight in the downtown for 80 years. In 1962, it was demolished to make way for a nondescript one-story building that would be the home of the J.C. Penney store for the next 20 years, until its move to a suburban mall in South Fort Collins. Two lovely old churches, St. Luke's Episcopal, built in 1882, and the 1898 First Methodist, met similar fates within a year of each other. The Methodists built a much larger edifice in southeast Fort Collins, so the old church at College and Olive was razed to make way for a dirt parking lot in 1964. St. Luke's suffered the same despairing sequence of events in 1965, except that it was replaced by the modern storefront on the corner of College and Oak. It had provided the longest service of any of the College Avenue churches. Still, the bulldozer of growth rambled on. Even the celebration of the town's centennial in 1964, with all of its recognition of heritage, could not stop the destruction. But it did serve to raise an awareness among many people of what had already been lost. By 1968, the city had a landmark preservation ordinance in place. During the next 7 years, the Landmark Preservation Commission was able to secure local designation for 5 structures and 1 site. Losses during the 1970s, though, overshadowed any gains made by providing protective landmark status to those few buildings. The decade of the 70s was one of contrast as the community struggled to decide what type of physical environment would be created during the closing decades of the century. The need to revitalize the downtown and the approach of the state's centennial and the nation's bicentennial promoted a keen awareness of what was being destroyed and what preservation opportunities were still available. However, there were other forces at work that would make dramatic changes in the cultural landscape. In May of 1970, a disastrous fire destroyed the oldest building on the Colorado State University campus, the 90-year-old Old Main. This was not a very favorable transition into the decade of the 70s. Over the next 10 years, structures seemed to fall at a stunning pace. Some architecturally unique buildings that had contributed to the charm of Fort Collins were lost, only to be replaced by parking lots. Perhaps the former home of the Parkers, an English family who came to the city during the agricultural boom at the beginning of the century, was a prime example. The house in the 100 block of South Meldrum had been built in 1905 and was a residence for almost 50 years. The charming English Tudor-style structure was converted to apartments until it was sold to Home Federal Savings. After building a high-rise onto their business, the need for more parking became critical. The Parker House and 3 older buildings around it were torn down and replaced by another blacktop parking lot. The home's entrance steps were left as access to the parking lot. During the middle of the decade, 3 outmoded red brick and sandstone school buildings disappeared. 2 were replaced by new schools. The 3rd was demolished to avoid having it designated as a local landmark. The old Lincoln Junior High started out as the city's first high school building in 1903. An addition in 1915 and another in 1923 completed the original high school, until classes moved to a new Fort Collins High School in 1925. For the next 50 years, it served as a junior high. Again, growth and the need for a modern building wrote a structure's epitaph. After the new Lincoln was finished on the northwest side of town, the old school fell in February 1976 to be replaced by the main part of the Lincoln Center. The 1907 Laporte Avenue School had gone down only 10 months earlier after students moved into the new Juan Foyana Elementary on the same block. Perhaps a more tragic loss was the classic turn-of-the-century country school Pleasant View at the corner of Drake and South Shields. Though it had been a public school for many years and then abandoned, a private school brought it back to life. When the owners, a group of Denver developers, asked the school group to move so the site could be developed, the parents offered to buy the structure and move it. The Landmark Preservation Commission began looking at the building for possible local designation. The offer to buy the school was refused, and the students moved out. Within a matter of weeks, the old school was a pile of rubble, and the denuded site sat empty for the next several years. The only reminders of the old school to survive was the ornate bell tower, which became the namesake of a North Side antique store, and some of the stately old cottonwood trees at the former site. The most spectacular demolition occurred in 1974 at the corner of Olive and Remington. A lovely 1887 church building, originally used by the Presbyterians, was leveled after several attempts to find alternative uses. After a couple of decades, it still remains as a graveled parking lot with a tall evergreen, the lone survivor of the destruction of an historic church. Disasters also played a role in the wrecking ball of progress. Fire damaged 2 floors of the Northern Hotel in 1975, making part of this historic building unusable. 2 years later, a tremendous explosion near Oak and College created havoc in the business district. Much of the downtown was already torn up as a major redevelopment was taking place. The explosion destroyed 2 structures, blew out windows for blocks, and took the entire back off of the Elks building. The 3-story structure, designed by the famous Fort Collins architect Montezuma Fuller and built as a YMCA in 1908, seemed beyond repair. The design solution for saving the 73-year-old building unfortunately involved encasing its historic facade in concrete. Other important structures, like the Arthur House at Mulberry and Peterson and the old Barclay Hardware building on Old Town Square, both built in 1882, were irreparably damaged when their painted brick facades were sandblasted. This procedure permanently removed the paint and the finish from the brick. At the time, the procedure was a generally accepted way of removing paint from historic buildings. Because of its damage to historic facades, this process was later prohibited as a restoration method in the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation of historic buildings. Many gains were made during this time as people began to view historic buildings as valuable economic resources. Many old homes and business blocks were restored or refurbished, but a total preservation ethic was not yet in place. During the 1980s and early 90s, there were still significant demolitions and alterations. The beautiful but neglected Loomis House tumbled in 1980. Abner Loomis had the house built in 1880 as a family home, complete with a carriage house on its south side. Prior to its demise, it held the Landmark Apartments. Urban decay due to minimal maintenance doomed the house when it was but a mere century old. The tall Strang grain elevator, a true landmark and vivid reminder of the city's agricultural past, was toppled to make way for a municipal parking lot in 1983. There were, in the lexicon of preservationists, several pop-ups and scrape-offs during this time, where modern additions were made to historic structures or where historic homes were removed to be replaced by modern ones. L.R. Rhodes, an early attorney, built the town's third brick house in 1873 in the 200 block of North College. It became part of the holdings of Kate Trimble, one of the town's most prominent businesswomen for many years. After the earliest two brick houses were torn down in 1910 for the path of the Union Pacific's tracks, it remained the oldest brick house in Fort Collins. Because of its vernacular or plain architectural style, many people failed to understand its historic value, and it was demolished. Our earliest homes were not high-style architecture. The destruction of the Rhodes Trimble House in 1990 and a few others served as painful reminders of the continued need for preservation vigilance. In the midst of the many losses, there were glimmers of hope. The 1879 Fairytale Cottage Avery House was purchased by the city in 1974 and restored by the Poudre Landmarks Foundation and Avery House Guild. It is now operated as a turn-of-the-century house museum. The Fort Collins Municipal Railway Society took the city's rusting and rotting 1919 streetcar, Bernie Car Number 21, which had sat outside next to the old museum for 25 years, and restored it to pristine condition. It now operates on weekends along West Mountain Avenue from May through September. The Old Town Square, an Opera Galleria projects of the 1980s, used historic structures to help create a revitalized downtown with a blend of the old and the new. Lovely restoration of the original 1882 firehouse and the Kissick Block, along with renovations of many homes in historic neighborhoods, prove the economic worth of these old structures and have served to create a heightened awareness of the need to preserve and protect from the wrecking ball of progress the city's valuable structural antiques, its lovely old buildings. But this preservation of the past will not continue without hard work in the present. If you're one of the people who feel that Fort Collins history is what makes it unique, I encourage you to get involved with preservation of the past today and stay involved tomorrow.